everyone. Going to start our second remote learning read aloud, I guess you would say, Hatchet by Gary Paulson. I chose this book. I usually read this book every year. I just think it's a fantastic book. This book I have read more times than any other book ever. This book was first read to me by my 5th grade teacher, and I've read it to several classes, and I've read it myself several times. It's just an absolute classic book. It's by Gary Paulson. We haven't read any of his books this year. One thing I'll say about Gary Paulson is he is an extremely detailed, descriptive writer. You know, there are some points in this book where he's so descriptive, I think he may even go overboard, but he really paints a great picture in your mind with all these great details, okay? So this is kind of what I would call a survival book. I think most people kind of know the basic plot of this book is our main character is going to be stranded in the wilderness. And the thing that I like to have great discussions with my class about is, what would you do in his situation? What would you do? His name is Brian Robeson. What would you do in this scenario? Do you think you could survive like him or not? So I'll be asking questions like that from time to time as we read this book. So I hope you enjoy it. It's one of my very favorite books, and I'm going to go ahead and dive in right now with chapter 1. If you've got a copy of the book, feel free to read along. Chapter 1. Brian Robeson stared out the window of the small plane at the endless green northern wilderness below. It was a small plane, a Cessna 406, a bush plane, and the engine was so loud, so roaring and consuming and loud that it ruined any chance of conversation. Not that he had much to say. He was 13, and the only passenger on the plane was the pilot named, what was it? Jim or Jake or something, who was in his mid-40s and who had been silent as he worked to prepare for takeoff. In fact, since Brian had come to the small airport in Hampton, New York to meet the plane, driven by his mother, the pilot had only spoken 5 words to him: get in the co-pilot's seat. So Brian is getting in a one-passenger plane. I don't know how many of you have ever been in a one-passenger plane, but it's really tight quarters. There's not much going on. I've only been on one once, and it kind of creeped me out a little bit. I wonder why Brian's getting on a plane. Page 2. Which Brian had done. They had taken off, and that was the last of the conversation. There had been the initial excitement, of course. He had never flown in a single-engine plane before, and to be sitting in the co-pilot seat with all the controls right there in front of him, all the instruments in his face as the plane clawed for altitude, jerking and sliding on the wind currents as the pilot took off, had been interesting and exciting. But in 5 minutes, they had leveled off at 6,000 feet and headed northwest, and from then on, the pilot had been silent, staring out the front, and the drone of the engine had been all that was left. The drone and the sea of green trees that lay before the plane's nose and flowed to the horizon, spread with lakes, swamps, and wandering streams and rivers. Now Brian sat, looking out the window with the roar thundering through his ears, and tried to catalog what had led up to his taking this flight. The thinking started. Always it started with a single word: divorce. It was an ugly word, he thought. A tearing, ugly word that meant fights and yelling. Lawyers. God, he thought how he hated lawyers who sat with their comfortable smiles and tried to explain to him in legal terms how all that he lived in was coming apart, and the breaking and shattering of all solid things, his home, his life, all the solid things, divorce. A breaking word, an ugly breaking word, divorce. Secrets. No, not secrets so much as just the secret. what he knew and had not told anybody, what he knew about his mother that had caused the divorce, what he knew, the secret. Divorce, the secret. I'm going to pause there for a moment. You know, you guys are getting older, okay? You'll be in 5th grade before we know it, and this book does have what I would say are some more mature adult types of things going through them. And Brian right now is talking about his parents' divorce. And I know a lot of you come from homes where there's divorce or things like that. It's a really painful, hard thing, right? So if Brian's parents are divorced and Brian's mom drove him to the plane, where do you infer possibly that Brian is going? To see his father? His father must be quite a long ways away if he has to take a plane to get to them. So, like I said, there are a couple of adult themes in this book. One of them is the secret Brian knows about his mother and their divorce and why they got divorced. And we'll get to that part, and I'll stop and talk a little bit about that. Halfway down page 3. Brian felt his eyes beginning to burn and knew there would be tears. He had cried for a time, but that was gone now. He didn't cry now. Instead, his eyes burned and tears came, the seeping tears that burned, but he didn't cry. He wiped his eyes with a finger and looked at the pilot out of the corner of his eye to make sure he hadn't noticed the burning and tears. The pilot sat large, his hands lightly on the wheel, feet on the rudder pedals. He seemed more a machine than a man, an extension of the plane. On the dashboard in front of him, Brian saw the dials, switches, meters, knobs, levers, cranks, lights, handles that were wiggling and flickering, all indicating nothing that he understood, and the pilot seemed the same way. Part of the plane, not human. When he saw Brian look at him, the pilot seemed to open up a bit and he smiled. Ever fly in the co-pilot seat before? He leaned over and lifted the headset off the right ear and put it on his temple, yelling to overcome the sound of the engine. Brian shook his head. He had never been in any kind of plane, never seen the cockpit of a plane except in films or television. It was loud and confusing. First time. It's not as complicated as it looks. Good plane like this almost flies itself, the pilot shrugged. Makes my job easy. He took Brian's left arm. Here, put your hands on the controls. Your feet in the rudder pedals, and I'll show you what I mean. Brian shook his head. I'd better not. Sure, try it. Brian reached out and took the wheel in a grip so tight his knuckles were white. He pushed his feet down on the pedals. The plane slewed suddenly to the right. Not so hard. Take her light, take her light. Brian eased off, relaxed his grip. The burning in his eyes was forgotten momentarily as the vibration of the plane came through the wheel of the pedals. It seemed almost alive. See? The pilot let go of his wheel, raised his hands in the air, and took his feet off the pedals to show Brian he was actually flying the plane alone. Simple. Now turn the wheel a little to the right and push on the right rudder pedal a small amount. Brian turned the wheel slightly and the plane immediately banked to the right. And when he pressed on the right rudder pedal, the nose slid across the horizon to the right. He left off the pressure and straightened the wheel and the plane righted itself. Now you can turn. Bring her back to the left a little. Brian turned the wheel left, pushed on the left pedal, and the plane came back around. It's easy, he smiled. At least this part. The pilot nodded. All of flying is easy. Just takes learning, like everything else. Like everything else. He took the controls back and then reached up and rubbed his left shoulder. Aches and pains. Must be getting old. Brian let go of the controls and moved his feet away from the pedals as the pilot put his hands on the wheel. Thank you. But the pilot had put his headset back on, and the gratitude was lost in the engine noise, and things went back to Brian Looking out the window at the ocean of trees and lakes, the burning eyes did not come back, but memories did, came flooding in, the words, always the words. Divorce, the secret, fights, split, the big split. Brian's father did not understand as Brian did, knew only that Brian's mother wanted to break the marriage apart. The split had come and then the divorce, all so fast, and the court had left him with his mother except for the summers and what the judge called visitation rights. So formal. Brian hated judges as he hated lawyers. Judges that leaned over the bench and asked Brian if he understood where he was to live and why. Judges with the caring look that meant nothing as lawyers said legal phrases that meant nothing. In the summer, Brian would live with his father. In the school year, his mother. That's what the judge said after looking at papers on his desk and listening to the lawyers talk. Talk. Words. Now the plane lurched slightly to the right, and Brian looked at the pilot. He was rubbing his shoulder again, and there was a sudden smell of body gas in the plane. Brian turned to avoid embarrassing the pilot, who was obviously in some sort of discomfort. He must have stomach troubles. So this summer, this first summer, when he was allowed to have visitation rights with his father, with the divorce only 1 month old, Brian was heading north. His father was a mechanical engineer who had designed or invented a new drill bit for oil drilling, a self-cleaning, self-sharpening bit. He was working in the oil fields of Canada, up on the tree line where the tundra started and the forests ended. Brian was riding up from New York with some drilling equipment. It was lashed down in the rear of the plane, next to the fabric bag the pilot had called a survival pack, which had emergency supplies in case they had to make an emergency landing. That had to be specially made in the city, riding in the bush plane with the pilot named Jim or Jake, or something who had turned out to be an all right guy, letting him fly and all, except for the smell. Now there was a constant odor, and Brian took another look at the pilot, found him rubbing his shoulder and down to his arm now, his left arm, letting go more gas and wincing. Probably something he ate, Brian thought. I'm going to pause there for a second. Something is wrong with the pilot. I think we can all infer at this point. Anybody know what symptoms start with maybe a sharp pain in the shoulder and body gas, meaning the pilot's gassy? Wondering if you know what symptoms that is. You know, Gary Paulson's given us some clues of some things to come. He mentions a survival pack on the plane. I think he mentioned that for a reason. Maybe Brian's going to be able to use this survival pack because we know Brian is going to be stranded somewhere. Let's see how much longer this chapter is. I think I'm going to leave it off right there for today and pick it up tomorrow, right in the middle of page 7. Kind of leave you wondering what's happening to the pilot, what's going to happen next. So I'll post more on Tuesday. See you guys then. Have a great remote learning day.